this topic is so important, and I want to try to give some perspective on the work that I did for the Rwanda Tribunal and how that relates to some of the things that you've heard today, because there is a body of law out there that has developed, and it comes in large part from the Rwandan genocide. So I wanted to give you a background on the Rwandan genocide. Exactly how did incitement play such a prominent role in the mass murder of almost 1 million people in such a short period of time? And then I want to talk about what the legal antecedents were a little bit that led to the tribunal formulating these legal principles, and then the actual cases where those legal principles were laid down by the tribunal. What are the principles that we can glean from those? And then look at more recent developments. And then I'd like to finish with a perspective on where I think things are going in the future, a couple of cases that I think we should be focused on as we look ahead. When talking about the Rwandan genocide, I think it's important to look at what led up to it and to see how the roots of incitement were laid down, and then see how it developed, because there was a period of incitement in Rwanda before the genocide, actually, that gave rise to the horrors in April to July 1994 during the genocide. And so there's incitement during that time period that needs to be examined within the context of the genocide. And then kind of getting perspective on, you know, what incitement did, what role it played. I think it's good to step back and consider that. But to situate it, you have to look at what led up to the genocide itself. Rwanda was a Belgian colony gaining independence in 1962, and around the time of independence, there was large-scale violence that was perpetrated by Hutus against Tutsis, and there are many reasons for that. I'm not going to get into that today, but suffice to say that there was a lot of resentment that had built up as a result of the way Belgium governed the colony. And when Belgium left and the Hutus were in power, terrible violence was inflicted on the Tutsis, who fled to neighboring countries. And one of the prominent groups that formed in Uganda, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, in 1990, they launched an invasion from the country's northern border coming down. So there starts to be some tension within Rwanda as they're dealing with this rebel group that's coming in. The economy wasn't doing very well, and so the Rwandan government, led by Juvenal Habyarimana, negotiated a peace, the so-called Arusha Peace Accords of August 1993, which called for the establishment of a transitional government with Tutsi rebel group participation, incorporating the Tutsi rebels into the Rwandan army, and then the arrival of a UN peacekeeping force known as UNAMIR. And UNAMIR was going to monitor the transition into the new government that would be established by the Arusha Accords. Habyarimana was in a tough spot because he had a lot of people in his clique of power who did not want to share power with the Tutsis, with the rebels, and yet at the same time the international community was telling him that this is what he needed to do. So he was trying to play the two off of each other and stay in power as best he could. But Hutu extremists ultimately felt that he was selling them out, and they felt that the Arusha Accords should not be implemented. And this is the lead up to all the violence. What starts to happen is that a media of extreme hate starts to form. One of the famous publications was a newspaper called Kangura, and you can see here, I have the arrow pointing to one of the infamous issues of Kangura, You can see a photo of Gregory Kayibanda, who was the first president of independent Rwanda when a lot of that initial violence took place. The machete, there's a question, you know, what do we do with the Tutsis? And then you see the machete. So within the written media, you certainly see language of hate and incitement. You also begin to see radio and hear messages on the radio exhorting Rwandans to violence. One of the famous, and I think now quite well-known radio stations, RTLM, Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, and Radio Rwanda, which was the state station, began to broadcast messages against the Tutsi, referring to them as inyenzi, cockroaches, and this is a theme that we've heard throughout today, the dehumanization. So this is part and parcel of incitement. You see it here as well. And you see that militias are starting to form, and extremist Hutu youth are getting weapons, they're training, they're being incited by the media and by the government, and all the elements are starting to come together for the perfect storm of this horrendous mass violence. And you start to see it even before the genocide breaks out. Tutsis are being beaten and murdered, and the head of the UNAMIR mission, Roméo Dallaire, starts to get information to the effect that there may be something horrible that's being planned, actually a genocide, and he reports this to UN headquarters and nothing happens. And so now the stage is set, and there's a couple of incidents that I think are interesting to talk about. What I refer to as the dress rehearsal for the Rwandan genocide. There were massacres in Bugesera, and this is not that far from the capital of Kigali. Radio Rwanda broadcast a fabricated communique that would have come from, I believe, Kenya, stating that the Tutsis had a hit list of people that they were going to kill, and sort of warning people that unless they did something, there were going to be mass killings that the Tutsi would perpetrate against the Hutu. This was all a fabrication, and it was all coordinated with the militia being brought to Bugesera. They were trucked in right after these incitement messages were broadcast, and then there was mass violence. Hundreds of Tutsis were murdered. And this was sort of the pattern that was set that would be used in April to July 1994. Another pre-genocide incitement episode that was famous was a speech of Leon Mugesera at the end of 1992. He was a prominent member of Habyarimana's party, the MRND, and he gave a speech calling for the extermination of the Tutsi via metaphors. One of the most famous was exhorting the audience to send the Tutsis back to Ethiopia, where, according to the stereotype, the ethnic hatred stereotype that had been broadcast about the Tutsi, that they were not really Rwandans, but they were from the north, they were from Ethiopia. And so they were different, they were alien. And the message was, let's send them back to Ethiopia via the Nyabarongo River. The Nyabarongo River was a place where Hutu bodies were dumped after the massacres in the early years of independence. So talking about sending them back to via the Nyabarongo River was clear incitement. Everybody pretty much in Rwanda understood that, and actually Mugesera was indicted and he fled to Canada, and his case in Canada, which was an immigration matter, became quite famous as well. Now, I mentioned that there was incitement before the genocide, there was incitement during the genocide. Let me talk briefly about the pre-genocide incitement on RTLM. I want to focus on RTLM, otherwise known as Radio Machete. There were 4 by RTLM before the genocide. One type of message was a general effort to create animosity toward the Tutsis, and I have the example here of, for example, criticizing Tutsis for having too much wealth. Something, of course, that anti-Semites have done vis-a-vis Jewish people. We see it here in the Rwandan context. Or talking about their physical characteristics. I mentioned that there was a stereotype that they came from the north, so that they were really thin and they had these thin noses, etc. This is a way of generating animosity toward them. Many broadcasts would, and it was kind of a way of brainwashing the audience by constantly referring to Tutsis as cockroaches or Nyenzi. And Inkotanyi, which was a Kinyarwanda word for a violent warrior or a killer from feudal times. And this was, again, to be equated with Tutsis in general, making Hutus think that Tutsis were either insects or mass murderers. You know, again, this notion of dehumanization. RTLM would acknowledge that it was anti-Tutsi and that it was inciting hatred toward the Tutsis. I give a couple of interesting examples that RTLM would tell listeners that it was trying to set people at odds with others, and it was trying to create tension, and I like this expression, heating up heads. You know, it was letting listeners know we need to heat heads up. We've got to get people worked up. And then perhaps the most chilling part of this pre-genocide incitement was that there were actual specific verbal attacks against particular Tutsis. And a prominent example, not long before the genocide started, at the beginning of April 1994, there was a broadcast where a doctor in Shangugu was denounced, and then 3 days later, the doctor was burnt alive in front of his house, which happens to coincide around the time of the start of the genocide, but it previews essentially what's going to happen in the genocide. On April 6th, Habyarimana is coming back from Arusha to negotiate the final implementation of the accords. His plane is shot down, and right away, roadblocks are set up all over Kigali. Death squads are going around Kigali and murdering prominent Tutsis and moderate Hutu politicians. Some Belgian UN peacekeepers, Blue Helmets, were murdered, and the goal there was to facilitate the international withdrawal of people who could stand in the way of a genocide being carried out. And sure enough, the international community pulls out, the killing starts to spread across the country, and RTLM picks up its broadcasts, and the whole cycle of mass murder begins. And by the middle of July, approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutu had been slaughtered, most by machete. And I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the role that the radio played and incitement played in the genocide. And I have this illustration of what would have happened that night, April 6th, and with two Rwandans listening to the radio. The man asks, "Que se passe-t-il?" What's happening? And the woman says, "On a tué Habyarimana." They've killed Habyarimana. And then you see the announcement from the radio, "Nous demandons à tous nos valeureux frères Hutus de ne pas laisser ces crimes impunis. Levez-vous, nos frères, levez-vous et allez au travail. Affûtez vos utiles, soulevez vos gourdins. Il faut éradiquer cette race de cancres-là. Cherchez-les dans tous les trous." And the translation of this would be, we ask all of you valorous Hutu brothers to not let this crime go unpunished. Rise up, our brothers, rise up and go to work. Sharpen your tools, lift up your bludgeons. We have to eradicate this horrible race of cockroaches, find them in all the holes. And this is a sense of what you would have gotten from the radio. This is at the outset of the genocide. Notice, go to work, right? That's code word for kill Tutsis. So you see code words are used a lot. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Again, the reference to cockroaches. Concrela is cockroaches in Kinyarwanda and Yenzi. So chilling language, and this is the sort of thing that would have been heard on the radio. Now, in addition to the categories that I talked about a moment ago, which continued, you have some new sort of even more intense broadcasts that go on by RTLM during the genocide. First of all, you get calls for blanket extermination of all Tutsis. Again, dehumanization and code words, as I mentioned, go to work. Secondly, talking about the fact that extermination was taking place and praising it, making it seem as though it was a normal thing. We heard that talk about that in the last panel with respect to what Palestinians think about terrorism, that it's just a normal thing and it's part of everyday life. There were calls for attacks on Unimir. There was a skeletal force that Dallaire was leading that was still there that could serve as witnesses to the genocide, and there were calls for attacks on them. And then at times downplaying the extermination or urging the population to hide any evidence of it to improve Rwanda's image among the international community. What you see here is tremendous evidence of a guilty mind, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. One of the elements in incitement to genocide is intent. You have to show genocidal intent, and you can see from these broadcasts that there's good circumstantial evidence of that during the genocide, and it was very effective in getting the population riled up. And remember, as I mentioned, that in that last slide, that there were specific calls for targeting Tutsi individuals. That continues. And RTLM is used quite effectively at roadblocks to signal that people are trying to escape. They may be coming by. Watch out, look for this person's name. They need to be killed. I give a couple examples here. This is one of the infamous broadcasts from June 4th, 1994, Kantano Habimana, saying 100,000 young men must be recruited rapidly. They should all stand up so that we kill the Inkotanyi and exterminate them. The reason we will exterminate them is that they belong to one ethnic group. Look at the person's height and his physical appearance. Just look at his small nose and then break it. So very chilling, racist language used to whip up the population to kill Tutsis. Georges Rougiou, who's the only white European who was convicted by the tribunal, a case that I worked on when I was there, he called upon the population, particularly the military and the Interahamwe, which was the name of the prominent militia group, to finish off the 1959 revolution. And the 1959 revolution, he's talking about in 59, there were massacres against the Tutsis, and finishing it off means many were killed, but not all. Now we need to finish the job, massacre the entire Tutsi population. So using metaphors here. I wanted to quote the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the trial chamber that heard all the evidence in the case, and Judge Pile in particular, saying to the defendants in announcing the judgment, the chamber accepts that this moment in time, the downing of the airplane on April 6th that I talked about, served as a trigger for the events that followed. That is evident. But if the downing of the plane was a trigger, then RTLM and Kangura were the bullets in the gun. The trigger had such a deadly impact because the gun was loaded. The chamber therefore considers the killing of Tutsi civilians can be said to have resulted, at least in part, from the message of ethnic targeting for death that was clearly and effectively disseminated through RTLM and Kangura before and after April 6, 1994. I think a very terse and insightful understanding of the role that incitement played in the genocide. So, I keep talking about this crime of incitement. What are its legal antecedents? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from Article 2 of the Genocide Convention from 1948, which defines genocide as a series of acts, including, for example, killing and causing serious bodily or mental harm, committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Article 3 then states that a number of related acts committed in furtherance of Article 2 shall also be punishable, and this includes, at Article 3b, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. You can then see how that transfers over because the Genocide Convention is incorporated directly into the statute for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and Article 2.3c of the ICTR statute mirrors Article 3b of the Genocide Convention, and in fact, several defendants have been prosecuted and convicted pursuant to this section of the ICTR statute, and I'm going to talk about those cases. So the ICTR cases have had the effect of fleshing out the elements of incitement to genocide. And you can see sort of the lineage from the Genocide Convention into the ICTR statute and then the cases. So let me just talk about some of the prominent cases. The first big case was the Akayesu case. Akayesu was a mayor in Taba commune, and he incited the Interahamwe militia, and he was convicted of incitement in 1998. In 1998 as well, Jean Kambanda, who was the prime minister of the Rump government during the genocide, he had called for murder in speeches on the radio. He pled guilty of, among other things, incitement charges. And then Georges Rougiou, who I talked about earlier, was an RTLM announcer in 2000. He pled guilty, and I referred to the metaphors that he used on the radio in inciting Hutus to kill Tutsis. And then the big case that I also worked on, the media case, this was the executives of RTLM, Ferdinand Nahimana and Jean Bosco Barreguiza, as well as the editor-in-chief of Kangura, Hassan Ngezi. You can actually see Ngezi with the headpiece sitting next to Nahimana, and then to the left there is Barreguiza. These cases allowed the tribunal to flesh out the principles of incitement. And they let us know that there were some important inquiries that needed to be considered to determine if there was incitement. First of all, where was the utterance issued? Is it sufficiently public? How was it interpreted by the audience? Is it sufficiently direct? Right? Because it's direct and public incitement to commit genocide. What was the state of mind of the person uttering the words? Was there sufficient intent? What is the content of the statement? Is it a permissible exercise of free speech, or is it criminal incitement? We have to distinguish between the two. And must there be resulting violence? In other words, is there a causation requirement? So let's briefly break it down. As far as direct goes, to understand whether or not a statement is direct, we have to look at it in light of its cultural and linguistic content, and within that cultural and linguistic content, whether the persons for whom the message was intended immediately grasp the implication thereof. So what language is being spoken? What are the sociolinguistic ramifications of that statement at the time that it's spoken, in the place that it's spoken? And based on that, did the person immediately grasp what it meant? So if the word Inyenzi was used, for example, as I've been explaining, that means cockroach. Within the context of the Rwandan genocide and the lead up to it, probably an expert witness, a sociolinguist, which is what we worked with for the media case, among others, would testify that the average Rwandan would understand that this meant cockroach, and that there was a sense that a cockroach is something that you stomp on and kill. Public, pretty straightforward. It needs to be a call for criminal action in a public place or by mass media. The intent is the same as the intent to commit genocide, which we looked at a moment ago. That comes straight from the Genocide Convention, Article 2, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So in uttering the incitement, there has to be that mens rea, or that mental state. Content is the real, I think, tricky part. And in my scholarship, I have pointed out that I believe the tribunal has broken content down into four main elements. First of all, we should look at the purpose. What is the purpose of the speech? Is it legitimate, such as news, historical research, those sorts of things? Or is it a direct call for murder and violence? And I'll elaborate on that in a minute. Text, what are the words themselves? Are there code words being used that seem to have significance from the words themselves, like in Yenzi? Context. I suggest that you look at both the internal and external context. The tribunal talks about context, but I think they need to be broken down. Internal context would be the speaker. What is the personal history of the speaker? Has the speaker uttered messages like this before? What was the tone of voice used, for example? And then external would be what's going on around the time in terms of, say, in the country. Is there violence that's being perpetrated against the group that's being targeted, for example? That would help situate whether or not it is incitement versus a legitimate exercise of free speech. And the final one is the relationship between the speaker and the subject. If the speaker is part of the government or part of the majority group that's oppressing the minority group that is the target of the incitement, then there's going to be a presumption, more or less, that it's incitement. If, on the other hand, it's a member of the minority group that's speaking out against the majority group or the group that controls power, then there's a sense that perhaps it's not incitement. At least the presumption is less. Let me talk a little bit more about purpose. I mentioned that you could have certain legitimate endeavors that would be clear as far as the purpose: historical research, dissemination of news and information, public accountability of government authorities. And then you could have, on the other end of the pole, very illegitimate objectives such as an explicit call for violence, like we saw in that broadcast from Kantano Habimana in June of 1994. What's difficult is kind of the twilight zone between those two. In other words, hate speech that's not explicitly calling for violence. And, you know, that can really go on both sides of the slide. I mean, you can see that, for example, someone could be trying to raise ethnic awareness. There's a good example given in the Tribunal's media case judgment where Jean Bosco Barraguiza talks about really go on both sides of the slide. I mean, you can see that, for example, someone could be trying to raise ethnic awareness. There's a good example given in the Tribunal's media case judgment where Jean Bosco Barraguiza talks about his childhood and how difficult it was to grow up as a Hutu under the oppression of Tutsis, his experience as a child. That was considered not to be incitement, or at least not to have a purpose of incitement. There was an example given from Kangura that a cockroach could not give birth to a butterfly. So there were metaphors that were used to be derogatory toward Tutsis, but that was not necessarily considered to be having a purpose of incitement. But then code words like "go to work," not explicit calls for violence, but yet understood that these would be an illegitimate objective, or predictions. And we see that actually in the context, and I'm going to talk at the very end about Iran and incitement coming from Iran. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, for example, has predicted the destruction of Israel. That can also be viewed as having an illegitimate purpose. I also, in my scholarship, am starting to say that there are certain evaluative factors that we should look at in determining whether there's incitement when we look at external context. I think it's important to look at the media environment. In other words, incitement is more likely in a coercive media environment with an absence of competing messages and frequent message repetition. And really the question here is, if you look at American jurisprudence on free speech, one of the key metaphors is the marketplace of ideas. If the marketplace of ideas is functioning properly, then in theory, good speech should be able to counter bad speech. And if it's not functioning properly, I think we're in an external context where we're more likely to see incitement. What is the political context? Incitement, I think we can find is more likely when there is political instability or absolutism in the political system, which heightens audience dependence on the communication media and thereby strengthens the influence of the hate message on audience members. Another one that I think we can look at is the existence or imminent outbreak of war. Genocide scholars have pointed to the empirical connection between genocide and war, between the perpetrating government and another sovereign, or between the perpetrating government and an internal armed rebel group. That tends to be a harbinger of genocide. I think if you look empirically at the genocides that have taken place in the 20th century, the big ones, Rwanda, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, war was happening in and around those genocides. The most recent case, the tribunal pronounced judgment on Simon Bakindi, who's a famous Rwandan pop singer, whose infamous songs, such as Nanga Aba Hutu, I Hate These Hutu, promoted hatred toward Tutsi. I know the title would make you think, well, isn't that promoting hatred toward Hutu? But actually the song is about hating Hutu who are tolerant toward Tutsis. And his songs were played on the radio and by militias during the genocide. And during the genocide, in late June, he was traveling in a vehicle, an Interahamwe vehicle, and he spoke on a loudspeaker to militias in an area where killing was taking place and told them to rise up against the Tutsi and not spare anybody. And on the way back, coming back in the same vehicle from where he had come, he asked them if they had killed the snakes. And he was convicted of incitement, not for the playing of his songs, because he did not play any role in their dissemination during the genocide, but for his exhortations on the car loudspeaker to the militia. And as a result of this, I posit that there should be two more content elements that we should consider. One is temporality. In other words, the speech must be contemporaneous with its dissemination, and the other is instrumentality. The speech should be disseminated by the speaker himself. And this is an issue when recordings are used, obviously. The other criterion that I think should be added to the list is channel of communication. Frankly, I think there's a difference in written versus broadcast material. Written material, I think, should be seen as less likely to entail incitement, whereas broadcast material, the opposite conclusion. Internet material, probably the same. And now, the contemporary application that I was talking about, we see a case of incitement nominally before the International Criminal Court in the Kenya case. The ICC has indicted a Kenyan radio announcer by the name of Joshua Arap Sang, who's accused of committing crimes against humanity in part through broadcasting messages during violence against certain Kenyan ethnic groups following the controversial 2007 says that she hopes I'm nearing the end. In fact, I am. I think this is my second to last slide, so we're doing well here. The controversial 2007 presidential election. Arap Sang's broadcasts are not in and of themselves the basis of any criminal charges against him. They are only used in support of non-speech related charges, murder and forcible transfer of population as part of a joint criminal enterprise with other defendants. Still, press accounts have erroneously indicated that Arap Sang is being prosecuted on incitement charges, and they've shown hostility toward the notion of incitement. So I think we need to be careful about how incitement is characterized, and the media doesn't like it, of course, when it feels that its own rights might be infringed with a charge of incitement. So that's one of the storm clouds that I see for incitement law developing in the future. The other area that I think we need to look at is Iran. The Iranian leaders, including the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, have called for the destruction of Israel both directly and indirectly. I think the JCPA has done a good job of documenting this. And I've talked about it in an article that I published a couple years ago. These have included extremely explicit calls. For example, Ahmadinejad's call for Israel to be wiped off the map, language that frankly in many ways is even more direct than the language from Rwanda, and less direct. For example, referring to Israel as a tumor that must be removed, or predicting Israel's destruction, or dehumanizing Israeli Jews by referring to them as animals or bacteria and the like, and then denying the Holocaust. And I think within the context of Iran developing nuclear weapons and its support for terrorist groups that are bent on Israel's destruction, there is a strong argument that could be made that the Iranian leaders may be liable for incitement to commit genocide. And I think we need to keep our eye on this. And if ever there's a case where there's a chance for mass destruction based on incitement, this is one that I'm quite concerned over. So looking forward, I hope that what we see as perhaps the best preventive tool of the legal principles that have developed around genocide, which is incitement to commit genocide. It's an inchoate crime. The crime is committed when the words are uttered. think about the name of the Genocide Convention. It's the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Prevention is first. Prevention is what we should be focusing on. And so I want to leave you with that thought, and I want to thank you for your attention.